This is the next lesson in the Richard and John scheme of work, Unit 2. We're now looking at past the Crusades. So the Crusades happened. We need to look at what happens next. And this lesson is going to look at Richard's capture and ransom. Now, after the Third Crusade, things didn't really go to plan for Richard. He actually ended up being captured for over a year. And this caused significant problems because don't forget, at the end of the Third Crusade, both Philip and Richard's brother John were actually trying to invade his continental lands in France, while John was also taking over parts of England, which was causing Richard some significant problems because he wasn't there to be able to deal with it. So this lesson, we're going to look at the capture of Richard. We're going to look at why his ransom was such a big burden on society. Now, if you can't remember what a ransom is a large sum of money to release someone from capture. And in the medieval period, the more important the person, the higher the demand for the ransom. So this caused significant problems for England, who had just been through a crusade. Richard had already demanded quite a significant level of money to pay for his crusade to try and defeat Saladin and recapture the Holy Land, which we know from the last YouTube video, he didn't and he wasn't able to successfully do. So, what happened after Richard failed in Jerusalem? So, Richard was anxious for many reasons. So, firstly, John had teamed up with Philip and began to attack Richard's continental lands. Those continental lands are the areas like Normandy, the places that are part of modern-day France today, but in the medieval period, France was split in half and split between the Angevin king, who at the time was Richard, and also the king of France, who at the time was Philip. Enemies were also giving Richard a bad name in Europe. Now, you had a man called Leopold of Austria. Now, Leopold was actually one of the leaders of the Third Crusade, but he left because he was angry at Richard because Richard refused to put Leopold's name next to his and Philip's after a successful besiegement. Because of this, Leopold of Austria spread many rumours around Europe that Richard murdered an individual called Conrad de Montferrat, who was actually killed by an assassin. Now, this actually caused a lot of people to turn against Richard, and if Richard was seen by any of them, the chances he would have been captured, which he was. Richard found it really difficult because of this to get home because there wasn't a safe route. If Richard went by land, then chances he would have tried to be captured. If going by sea, that would have been all well and good, but he also faced some serious weather conditions. So getting home wasn't going to be easy for Richard. And the reason for this was because he had numerous enemies because of the rumours that were spread. So what he did was he headed for the island of Corfu and sailed up the Adriatic coast. Now, Italy was definitely a no-go because of enemies. Now, remember, on the way to the crusade, Richard actually conquered a part of Italy called in Sicily, which caused problems, caused a lot of anger towards Richard and what he stood for. So the first task you need to do is understand why Richard was so anxious. So write a tweet. This is a bit of an old-fashioned use. So imagine that Richard had Twitter. That's a good old historical anachronism. And explain the issues that he faced following the Third Crusade. So at King Richard I, just write down a tweet talking about why Richard had issues following the Third Crusade. Pause the video here, spend about 5 minutes on this task, and then we can move on to look at the actual capture and the ransom itself. Right, so task 2, we're going to be looking at Richard's kidnap, ransom, and release. Now, you've got a range of questions and answers. Now, if you've got an answer, you must find out the question. And if you've got a question, you must find out the answer. Now, I'm going to go through the information on the PowerPoint first, and then I would spend about 10-15 minutes to find the questions and answers. So, Richard's ransom. I'm going to underline some key information here. So it's quite important that while I'm going through this, you're listening, getting ready to try and find out those questions and answers. So Richard was anxious to get back to his empire, his Angevin empire. While he'd been on crusade, his brother John had teamed up with Philip and attacked Richard's continental lands. Furthermore, his enemies had been giving him a bad name in Europe. The man who Richard humiliated at Acre, Leopold of Austria, had spread the rumour that Richard had been behind the murder of Conrad de Montferrat. Conrad was killed by assassins in 1192. Richard found there was virtually no safe route that he could take back home. He headed for the island of Corfu and then sailed up the Adriatic coast. He could not travel through Italy, which he did on the way to the Holy Land, as it was now full of enemies. There's a lot more information here. So, let's have a look at the capture. In November 1192, Richard was shipwrecked off the northern Adriatic coast. So Richard, he took the sea route, but he became shipwrecked, which was a problem because if he started to travel by land, he might have been noticed, which means he could have been captured. So him and his companions were forced to travel across land. That's not a good sign for Richard. They disguised themselves as pilgrims. Now, a pilgrim is someone that goes on a religious walk to repent their sins. But it was not long before they were recognised. Richard was arrested and imprisoned by Leopold of Austria, his old enemy. In February 1193, Leopold sold Richard to Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor. The emperor was overjoyed with his prisoner. He wrote gleefully to Philip to tell him of the news. So, Richard was captured by Leopold, sold to Henry VI, and then Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, wrote to Philip to say, I've got Richard. Now, if you're Philip, you're going to be loving life here, because that means Philip has access to the lands that he wants. Now, Richard's life was never at risk. The reason for this is chivalric code. So the purpose of capturing a knight was to claim a ransom. You would not capture someone to kill them in those days. You would capture someone to get money for them. Okay, that's really important that you understand that, is that, you know, it's very, very different, okay, the chivalric code. It's about being honourable. Richard would be worth a very high price because he was such an incredible knight and also overwhelmingly positive, you know, a good leader. Soon, Henry, Leopold, and Philip were haggling over the price they should demand. Eventually, they agreed they would demand the sum of 100,000 marks, which was about £66,000. And they'd also demand an extra 50,000 marks, £33,000, which would be covered by sending over hostages. So what that means is that nobles in England would be sent as hostages to pay for that money. The money would then be split between Henry and Leopold. Philip would not receive any money, but that was okay because while Richard was in prison, he would take Richard's land, which was a win-win for Philip, or so he thought. Now, the ransom was a huge demand to make on England. The population had already paid a high price to basically help Richard go on crusade. John had no desire to pay the ransom. Just ignore that. That should be an S. He had spread the rumour that Richard was dead before travelling to France to declare homage to Philip. And what that means is that John basically put Philip in charge of him. By declaring homage, Philip will then be John's overlord. Okay, so he would basically John would have to answer to Philip. The reason he did this was in the hope of securing Angevin continental lands for himself. And finally, he claimed he was the true king, as he was the legitimate heir to Richard. However, at this point, the letter from Henry containing the news of Richard's imprisonment and the demand for ransom arrived. Envoys were sent to visit Richard and negotiate his release. So that put a bit of a spanner in the works for John, because John was going around saying, my brother's dead, I'm the next king. And then the letter came from Henry saying, Richard's alive and we want a ransom. Now, when the messengers, the envoys, went to visit Richard, he was actually in good spirits. He was not worried about John taking his throne. Henry put Richard on trial for treason. Now, this was quite a surprising turn of events, but Richard spoke so well that he actually won the German princes over. And as a result, the emperor dropped the charges and Richard agreed to the ransom if the emperor would act as a peacemaker between Richard and Philip once he was released. So Richard said, okay, we'll pay the ransom as long as you help me with Philip when I'm out. Now, the problem was Richard thought this could be done very quickly. 100,000 marks was 2 billion in today's money. It wasn't easy to get. So Richard's mum, Eleanor of Aquitaine, helped raise the ransom. John didn't do much. He was loving life that his brother was in prison. And actually, John and Philip offered Henry 80,000 to keep Richard for longer, which is crazy to think. But the longer Richard was away, the more it was going to benefit John and Philip. Now, the way the ransom was collected, land tax on every landowner in England. There was a 3,375 tallage on the dues, so tallage is a general tax. All gold and silver from the churches was sold. The King of Scotland gave £1,350. A year's worth of wool was taken from the Cistercian monks who sold wool for their trade. A lot of people sacrificed a lot in England to pay this ransom, which shows how much of a respected king Richard was. Now, the ransom took 6 months to collect, and Richard was eventually released on the 4th of February 1194. He was in prison for 1 year and 6 weeks. The ransom wasn't the only price paid. In a secret agreement with the emperor, Richard agreed to give Henry VI the English crown and receive it back as a vassal. So actually, Richard agreed to give his own crown to the Holy Roman Emperor and receive it back as like a loan, because that's what being a vassal is. You're looking after it for someone. Richard landed in England in March 1194, but he didn't stay for long. He crushed John's rebellion in England, and John begged for mercy. He gained back Nottingham Castle, which was a very important northern castle. He appointed Hubert Walter as head of the government, and in May 1194, Richard had left again. The reason for this was to get Normandy back, a place that he lost to Philip while he was in prison. This was the last time Richard was ever seen in England. He never came back to England again following March 1194. So these are the questions and answers you have to do. I'm not going to go through them, but my advice would be go back to this information. Remember, if you've got an answer, you've got to write the question. If you've got a question, you've got to write an answer. Okay? So you've got 1, 2, 3 slides to do. If you haven't got the sheet, then write them out. Spend about 15 minutes doing this. Now, it's just a mid-lesson check to make sure we've been understanding this. Answer true or false as we go through. When Richard became shipwrecked, he hid his identity by dressing as a monk. I'll let you have this one. This one's actually false because he dressed as a pilgrim. When Richard was captured, he was sold to Henry V. Richard's life was never at risk when he was captured. The ransom price was 100,000 marks. John did not want to pay the ransom and started a rumour that Richard married and was never returning. Negotiators were sent to visit Richard to discuss the ransom. Richard's mother sent a letter to Philip pleading for his help. Jews were taxed higher to pay for Richard's ransom. Richard was held for 2 years and 2 months. And in May 1194, Richard left England and never returned again. If any of these are false, just to show that you know, write the true statement next to it. Now, task 3, why was the ransom so serious? Just want you to write down 3 reasons why the ransom was so serious for England. This could be quite a nasty question if you got it in the exam. You could have it as a how far do you agree question. You could have a question, how far do you agree that Richard deserved the title of Richard the Lionheart? This might go against it because of the situation he put England in. So write down 3 bullet points about why the ransom was so serious, and then next to the bullet points, explain why it was so serious. Get that AO2 analysis in for your exams. Now, the homework is to begin revising for a recall assessment. Now, if this is a part of the lessons that you're doing, then obviously brilliant. If you're just using this for revision purposes, ignore this homework. But that is the lesson on Richard and his ransom.